Ok, sim. Olá, bom dia a todas e a todos. Portanto, queria começar por agradecer às organizadoras. É um prazer poder moderar a apresentação do André Amálio, que se vai debruçar sobre a maneira como as práticas teatrais nos permitem repensar e transformar a história e a memória coloniais. Na sua apresentação, o André Amálio
presentation, André Amálio is going to speak about Hotel Europa that he founded together with Teresa Picova. He is somebody that works on Portuguese colonialism and post-colonialism. He has a master degree by the Golden University of Lisbon. He was a teacher. He is an actor, performer, and he worked with several others, such as Marie-Gabelle Copi, Luís Castro, among others. And Hotel Europa is responsible for different theatrical performances. He is also responsible for several narratives, several works on the Portuguese colonial epoch. In his presentation, André will address a set of strategies that have to do with the relationship between different aspects, both politicals and the production of theatre in Portugal, and in which way his group is trying to diversify its opposition to the relationship between North and South. Thank you very much, and I'll give you the floor now. Thank you very much. And good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you very much for this great introduction. And thank you very much to the members of the organization for the invitation that was addressed to me. I think that this program is very interesting and urgent. Let us kick off. I am André Amálio, as it has been said. I am the director of Europa company, together with Teresa Elrich-Kovar. She's from the Czech Republic. And so we represent a mix, between theater and dance. We got to know each other during our masters, when we're working for our masters at Goldsmith. This was a very important time for me and for a change that I felt happened in me with regards to what I felt vis-à-vis the Portuguese colonial history. Up to then, this was not that important to me. I would accept without any criticism everything that had been taught to me in school up to that moment. I, learned the history of Portugal, the discoveries, the colonial period of Portugal, and I had no critical opinion vis-à-vis this. And it was during my time at Goldsmith and also my colleagues that were doing also that were working for their masters, and they asked me lots of questions vis-à-vis Portuguese colonialism. So I understood that there was a sort of a hole, in this field. It was a kind of a taboo in the Portuguese society, but even inside, even in my family, we did not speak about that. My parents lived in Mozambique at different moments. My father had lived in Mozambique while it was a former Portuguese, while it was a Portuguese colony. He was there in the 1960s. He was a police officer. My father lived in Kliman, and my mother lived in Lourdes Marques at the time. My mum was a nun at the time. So, in a way, it is a bit of a picture of what Portugal was during that period. Portugal was a rather poor country, and my mum decided to go into a convent, and to, in a way, it was a way to escape poverty. And about this colonial period, I knew nothing. I did not know what they saw there, what they felt there, and this was a taboo. So from that point onwards, I felt that it would be important to actually study the Portuguese colonial history, to study my own history of life, understand my family, and why this was being hidden to me for so many years. So this led me to actually start my PhD at Roehampton University in Lisbon, and via documental theatre I decided to reflect on this, especially during the 1950s, when the movements in Africa started to happen, and Portugal was under a fascist government, and the colonial identity was seen as the national identity. So there was a big resistance against any talk on independence movements. So out of my work, the result of my work was three works. One on the refugees, people that lived in the former colonies and that decided to return to Portugal. They did not identify themselves as retornados, refugees, former people that were living there, that decided that the colonizers, and that decided to return to Portugal after the independence. And they had very dramatic stories, because some of them lost everything in Angola. The civil war had started. Some of the people had to just to run for their lives only with what they had on. And there was also this transformation process towards a Marxist government with Samora Machel. I'm speaking about Mozambique. So many people were not really aware of what was going to happen once Mozambique would become independent. So there is this massive flow of people to mainland Portugal, to European Portugal. And if we look into the recent crisis of refugees in Europe, we see that in fact what happened in Portugal at that time was really much bigger. None of the countries received more people. Nobody actually reached this figure of almost 10% of the population. This was how big the number of refugees that fled from the former Portuguese colonies. The second spectacle was called Passport. This was looking into this revolutionary period and tried to look into this dichotomy between colonizers and colonized, and tried to look into the experiences of each of these, and to look into their life stories, their families. And in the case of the Portuguese settlers, it looked into those that decided to continue to live in those countries, people that also other people that were part of the resistance against Portuguese colonialism. The last spectacle, which is called Colonização, looked into the most dramatic moment of Portuguese history. This was known as the colonial wars. I would rather call them freedom, struggles for freedom, and in fact they speak about what happened after 1961 in Angola, the struggle of independence movements against Portugal, and that this spectacle also looked into these from a different angle. Usually what we hear is about Portuguese soldiers, what they went through, all the dramas in their lives, and what we wanted to do was to actually look into the stories of people that were fighting for freedom, why they decided to join those the freedom fighters. That was the story that we wanted to actually tell. This was research that started in 2003 and ended in 2019 with 3 spectacles that were not part of this work for my PhD. I felt I should do these after I concluded my PhD. And this was called Amores Pós-Coloniais, Filhos do Colonialismo, and then another performance that was called The End of Portuguese Colonialism. So one of these shows spoke about the colonial structure and how it still marks the relationship between people in the present. Another of my projects looked into what happened after the independence, and the marks that the past leave on people even after independence. So I believe it is very important to reflect about what happened in the world at that time. This topic began to be debated by different artists in cinema, theater, literature. The activism began to increase, and in fact this discussion that we've had in the Portuguese society, but that had been only on focused on certain fringes, started to be presented on stage, and also to appear on the radio, on TV. And at the same time this was happening here in Portugal, we saw later on that Trump succeeded Obama in Brazil. Bolsonaro was in power. In France, the right-wing parties are very strong, and that is something that happens a bit all over Europe. And in Portugal, we felt that because we had lived 48 years in dictatorship, we were a bit free from all this phenomena, but we got to the conclusion that it was not so, because we have now a right-wing party that is now the third political party in size. So I believe that there is a global movement to transform society globally all over the world, but obviously this movement, and the same happens with all the big transformations, this is something that does not happen in a peaceful and simple manner. It takes time, there is an opposition, there is a reaction to those transformations, and what we are seeing now, and with the new with this election in Italy of a prime minister from a fascist party really underlines the fact that the struggle is going to be a difficult one, and a long one as well. Now back to my work, and I would like to speak about Paul Gilroy. He's one of the most important people when it comes to this post-colonial discussion, and he's been speaking a lot on the way the old imperial countries look to their past, and about this dichotomy and trying to build a narrative of their colonial history, and at the same time have a certain nostalgia about the older times. We have other thinkers in Portugal that feel that it is very urgent to actually look into the past. I'm sorry, says the speaker. He is aware that he was not changing the slides. I'm sorry, says the speaker. So the past imperial past continues to shape our life. Now this is a quote for António Sousa Ribeiro and Margarida Califato Ribeiro. They say it is urgent to actually look into our story and to tell that story in a totally different manner. Now, back to what I said at the beginning, this need to actually leave my country, to be able to look into the history, into my history. This was a picture that was used for a first project. This was a map that was created during fascism. What they did was to actually put the former Portuguese colonies on top of the map of Europe to actually show that Portugal is not that small a country. It's a bit ironic. I mean, small countries feeling that they are smaller than others. This is a feeling of inferiority. And this map was also a map that was presented at an exhibition on the colonies in 1934 at Oporto, and we had people that had been brought from the former colonies, that they were forced to come. They were present in this exhibition to actually try to interpret their own lives, their lives, that their villages were rebuilt, and they were there so that European whites could actually see how they lived. This was also portrayed in Amores Postcoloniais. This was about the figure of a woman from Guinea-Bissau called Rosita. She was photographed in an erotic manner. She would go about her daily chores half naked, and for that reason, that situation, for the Portuguese settlers was something that was a bit, or rather, exciting, and there was this idea of Portuguese men going to the colonies, trying to look for success, for advantage, but also to build a relationship with people in these countries. I'd like to speak a little bit about documental theatre, what it is, and it is a theatre that works outside fiction. It deals with things that in fact it happened, and it uses in its projects real documents, testimonies, videos, photographs, and it is also important, to keep in mind this idea of Roland Barthes on the effect of reality of artworks, giving an artwork, a special feeling that connects the spectator to that work of art, and that is connected to real events. During our work, one of the things that were always very important for us was actually to show that something that was mentioned by Carol Martin, and that she calls the theater of real, people that use real things to actually make art, and to show that art is results from a context. The truth results from a context. It is always subject to manipulation, and especially in this area, this was very much polarized in the history of Portugal, and it seemed to us to be important to share different ways of thinking about this, and different ways of living and experiencing this past. Now I'd like to speak a little bit more about Portugal is not a small country, which is the name of another project. This is about those refugees I mentioned earlier, and what was important for us was to actually understand the strong load of colonial nostalgia that we saw in most of these people, a vision that is totally critical vis-a-vis what is to be a settler in those African territories, and this leads us to an ideology that is part of this colonial way of thinking, which is Luso-Portuguese tropicalism. This was something that was defended by a Brazilian author that felt that Portuguese colonialism was good because the Portuguese had certain characteristics that no other people had, and they had the capacity to actually get to a certain territory, and they had the capacity to mix with the populations of those territories. And this concept of Portuguese tropicalism is something that was rejected by the fascist dictatorship we had in Portugal, because Gilberto Freire was defending multicultural societies. And in the 30s, Salazar and the Portuguese regime is much more interested on studies on the purity of the Portuguese race. And it is only at the end of the Second World War, when we had the end of fascism in Europe and we have a series of independences, that the Portuguese dictatorship welcomes this concept of Gilberto Freire and starts to defend a unique space that was created by the Portuguese people, and that was this multicultural and mixed place. And we all know this sentence that resulted from this period, and the sentence is God invented man, and the Portuguese invented colored people. So this is the I'm a bit stressed because of time, says the speaker. This idea, the arrival of the white man that then starts that mixes with the African with an African woman, and then this in fact hides oppression and exploration of men, such as Gerald Bender mentions and criticizes in his book. And I felt it was very curious. I mean, in most of the interviews that I conducted to former Portuguese settlers, is that, and these interviews were conducted in between 2014 and 2017, this Portuguese tropicalism maintained, the idea that Portugal is not a racist country, and this is something that they still believe, and these ideas are still considered in the Portuguese society and not assessed in a critical manner, despite the fact that these days we have a history that is taught to children that is slightly different from the way, from the history that was taught to me. We have this idea of discoveries, the trade. We do not speak, for instance, about slave trade, about that part of oppression that was carried out by the Portuguese for centuries, and that is something that is important that we should look into and to urgently.
Este ato colonial que está ali no segundo ponto é de facto uma foi uma coisa escrita pelo António Oliveira Salazar, o ato colonial de 1930, e está aqui de facto todo o pensamento do Estado Novo e que continua ainda muito presente na história portuguesa e na maneira como nós contamos a nossa história, dizendo que é a essência da nação portuguesa possuir e colonizar terras ultramarinas e civilizar as suas populações indígenas. Eu agora queria-vos só mostrar um pequeno excerto de um vídeo deste trabalho, para terem uma ideia mais concreta do que é que foi.
Olha, as praias aí na Cala. Olha, a pessoa ia para a praia, a gente caminhava, via-se o fundo do mar, o fundo, até a pessoa não ter pé. Eu dizia, olha, eu para aí não vou, pode haver tubarões. Não, aqui não há tubarões, só há...
Desculpem, não está aqui a passar. Alguém pode aqui dar uma assistência?
This opportunity to inform that there will be no interpretation of the excerpt of the play, since a script was not provided to us.
Olha, as praias aí na Cala. Olha, a pessoa ia para a praia, a gente caminhava, via-se o fundo do mar, o fundo, até a pessoa não ter pé. Eu dizia, olha, eu para aí não vou, pode haver tubarões. Não, aqui não há tubarões, só há camarão. Por isso é que a gente chegava a casa, era só camarão que a gente comia. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. E agora vão buscar um pá à vossa frente, e juntam aqui perninha com perninha, e assim vai abaixo.
E quando eu estava no meio do curso, fui para a tropa.
E fui parar a arma de transmissões. E fui parar a arma de infantaria, que era a pior. Que essa era a parte mais complicada, porque eu, como era transmissões, tinha uma função diferenciada. E andei lá quase 4 anos. Pá, são 4 anos que tu sentes a falta para o resto da vida. O microfone é aqui. É para aqui. Olha, eles sofreram muito. Os negros sofreram muito. Sofreram muito mesmo. Muito. Levaram pancada. Era uma coisa... Eu ia ali, eu quando via aquilo, eu ficava aterrorizada. Mas ali era uma vida muito boa. Era uma vida mesmo... Ali era uma vida... Aquilo, as praias, era tudo lindo, tudo... Havia uma qualidade de vida. E tudo barato, por quê? Tudo à custa com a exploração dos... não dobra. Deviam estar para aí uns 50 graus dentro do avião. Toda a gente chorava, a criança choravam, gritavam, ainda bem que os meus conseguiram dormir. O avião teve que ficar às escuras. Vieram uns homens com armas e fizeram uma coisa... Ninguém se podia ir a levantar, ninguém podia ir à casa de banho, ninguém podia circular, ninguém podia sair do avião. Tínhamos que estar em silêncio, as luzes apagadas, e logo que pudessem levantavam o voo. Eu só sentia, toda eu escorria a água da pouca roupa que trazia vestida, que eu nem me lembro o que é que trazia vestido, mas só sentia assim a água a escorrer. Eu acho que metade, a maioria das pessoas nem consegue.
Ok. Não vou avançar mais.
I will stop here, says the speaker.
Vamos a falar daquela... Havia esta nostalgia colonial muito presente.
So we felt the nostalgia, colonial nostalgia, that was very present. So we had to search the archives and search for writings to be able to dive further into the topic and establish a different type of relationship with the Portuguese colonial empire, and to arrive at the type of racism, discrimination that most people did not describe, the most of the people that we interviewed did not speak about. The other show, Passport, it was directed by myself, Selma Mamous, who is a Mozambican singer, and Teresa Havichkova. The starting point was changes in citizenship that changed after the 1974 revolution. Until then, everybody living on continental Portugal were considered Portuguese and were entitled to have the Portuguese passport. But there was a change to the law, the citizenship law in 1974, and a selection was conducted, leaving out thousands of people who were then considered immigrants. They actually had been linked to the colonies and were even began being persecuted in these former colonies. Some of them even assassinated in Guinea-Bissau. So after the independence, Portugal simply ignores a large part of its population. Some of them have even fought during the colonial wars, and after the independence of the colonies, they were abandoned and forgotten. So this show talks about the archive that was covered in plastic, almost as if trying to be concealed. And we discovered, or we enacted the discovery and unveiling, because we wanted to unveil the official history. Recurrently talks about memory and states that authoritarian studies used education, etc., to convey an official history that is publicly celebrated, but which is a history that is very far from reality. It's not a history that is multiple. It only tells one side of the story. And for us, it was important to look at what Foucault calls counter-memories and to contest this idea of a national memory or official memory by listening to people who went through those times and have different personal stories that contest this and counter the official story, history. During this show and during this whole period of my PhD research, that I was faced with new realities of Portuguese colonialism. I strongly recall attending a class of my PhD studies, and we were discussing white slave traffic. And only then did I realize, and actually I'd been an excellent history student. I knew all of the dates by heart of the Portuguese discoveries when we arrived in India, here and there, but there was one date that had not been taught to us, which is the date when slave trafficking in the Atlantic Ocean had begun. And then I realized precisely how political power chooses precisely the dates and the stories that they want to tell the audience. It was from that day on that I decided to search more about our past, and this past in particular. The last show, Liberation, which talks about the liberation wars. Nelson Macons, who is a DJ, and Lucilia Raimondo, who is an actress, starred in this show. And they told us these stories of liberation while questioning us about our relationship with the past. Coming back to theatre, and theatre most of the time seen as a place where things that take place are not real, are not true, so a space of no truth, of non-truth. So at the end, audiences at the end of these shows would come up to me and ask, is this true? Did it really happen? Rancière, Roland Barthes talk about the power of the audience and the empowerment of the spectators. I felt that it was important for me that the audience question what was happening on the stage, and thus go out and try to search more about the colonial past, Portuguese colonial past, and try to find out why it was being told in this way. This is what happened to me, and so I also wanted the audiences to go out after the show and try and find out more about this story and how it can be retold and why it should be retold or told in a different way. And I have one other small video to show you.
Esta é uma fotografia do meu pai, onde eu estarei nos anos 50 e 60. E o meu pai é esta pessoa que está aqui. É este branco que está aqui no meio dos outros polícias, que são os polícias negros, a que chamavam de cipaios. E eu, quando comecei a fazer esta investigação, eu percebi-me de facto que havia uma enorme repressão do sistema colonial português. E que muitas vezes os polícias brancos mandavam os cipaios fazerem esses atos de violência com a população negra. E eu gostava de perguntar ao meu pai, eu gostava de saber se ele participou em algum desses atos de violência, se ele mandou fazer, se ele testemunhou, se ele foi cúmplice. Mas o meu pai faleceu em 2010, muito antes de eu começar a fazer este trabalho. Eu fiquei com estas perguntas todas por lhe fazer. Se calhar por isso é que estamos aqui hoje a fazer este espetáculo.
Os nossos bairros eram de madeira e zinco, ou de caniço, como se costumava dizer, porque eram, portanto, de construção precária. O bairro depois tinha a zona de cimento, não é? A cidade branca. Mais de 95% da cidade colonial era uma cidade branca. Portanto, era um lugar onde nós íamos ou para ir para a escola, os nossos pais ou para ir trabalhar, mas nós tínhamos a consciência de que aquele mundo não nos pertencia, ou melhor, de que nós não fazíamos parte daquele mundo.
O que me moveu a entrar na luta foi realmente o ideal de que aquele meu país tinha de ser independente e, ao ser independente, ele ficava liberto da opressão colonial. Era violento. Dizer que depois tomou o caminho que eu queria, não tomou, não interessa, mas pronto, pelo menos uma coisa tomou. O indivíduo que era objeto passou a ser sujeito, o angolano. Isso para mim é importantíssimo.
Please ask the speaker to use the microphone. We don't have any sound. You saw the headsets because we were enacting the interview, so the actors would put the earphones on, and they were hearing the real voices of the interviewees, and they actually were reproducing what they were hearing. And this is how we conveyed the testimonies. So there was clear separation between when we were the ones telling the story, so we didn't have the earphones, and then when we had the earphones, it meant that we were telling the stories of real people, real people that we had interviewed. As for the issue of Portuguese theatre and colonial discussion, this was a taboo in the past. It was often So I was saying that from 2014 and 2015, we have a movement in Portuguese theatre and Portuguese creators who feel the urge to address these topics, discuss these topics publicly, which was the case of these theatre groups that you see here listed on the screen. Teatro Griot in particular I find very relevant, and Aurora Negra, who is more recent project by only black actors, as is the case of Teatro Griot. Nowadays, what we see in Portuguese theatre is that these topics are addressed from different angles. The actors speak from different starting points, and I think that that is very enriching for Portuguese theatre. And I hope that these are the first steps in the direction of significant change. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, André, pelo...
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your magnificent presentation. Before opening up the discussion to the audience, I have a few questions about experimental theatre and how it adopted a third form eliminating gender, or a third genre, and how this genre is polyphonic, and how memory occupies a post-memory place and producing counter-history and counter-memory, all the while revising and revisiting the binary duality between settlers and colonials. Documentary theatre indeed does work on a reality. In our case, it starts with memory, and we base ourselves a lot on testimonials or documentation in archives, which allows us to work with real life issues. And by addressing recent past as well, all of this was part of our homes, our families. It was experienced very recently, if not very directly by us. It was experienced by our uncles or our parents or our grandparents. They are the owners of these stories. And these shows often tear down these walls so that we can hold these discussions at home. During my interviews, an interview I was carrying out for the first time, the husband and wife were asking questions they had never asked in their life. For the first time, the wife asked the husband if he had killed anyone during the colonial war. So I think that documentary theatre also has this power of enabling or going beyond fiction. It places us before the object in a completely different way. As for our own theatre company, we always try to recreate with the people who are carrying out that work. And Selma Mamous, for example, in Passport was directly related to the co-creation of the show. Filhos do Colonialismo did not use this verbatim technique. It used the people who were involved either directly or indirectly through their families, and they were the ones who went on stage to tell their stories. So there is always the relationship with the other and with someone else who came from a different background. I think we have already a hand in the air in the audience, so we can initiate our discussion with the audience.
Thank you very much. It was a really very interesting lecture. We learned a lot, and it's really fantastic what you are proposing. My question is about the context, the audiovisual and communication context. In which way what you are proposing has some kind of resonance in the Portuguese media system, or you feel isolated, proposing a discussion that, as you said, inside families people didn't engage in any kind of conversation about the topic. They were maybe ashamed. Do you feel that you are isolated? You know, you talk about that there are other theaters and probably there are some writers, but in any case that is in a bubble. And I want to see if this bubble dialogues with the general mass media or not, and which kind of a strategy do you try to develop in order to open the debate at national level?
I don't feel isolated at all. I think the work that we have done on these topics have been very openly received. Immediately from audience reaction in the performances themselves, people came, and lots of people were also coming from my own positions, thinking, my God, how did I never really question our colonial history? How were we so naive to believe in this kind of romanticized way of telling our history? How could have this been? So there's lots of people that have agreed, that agree with this and this need to change. And I also have been, for example, invited to interventions in the national TV, in the radio, in the newspapers. So I think this discussion is really being disseminated through many different channels. And this is not just me. Other actors, other thinkers, are also disseminating this. Of course, in the other hand, you also feel this opposition. You also feel, and more in the last years, you are starting to have people openly say, no, this was not like this. You are exaggerating. This is not true. I have felt more in the last years an opposition thinking of people saying, no, we don't want to tell our history in a different way. This is also a movement that is starting, and it's also growing. But what I think is that there is an open struggle going on, and there is an open discussion. I think this is it's really out there. Even yesterday in the Portuguese news, there was a big report on police abuse and how many people of the police forces are making groups on the social media, spreading hate messages and xenophobic, anti-LGBT, but very aggressively talking about killing politicians. And this is coming out. This is being talked about. And maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, no one would even pay attention to this. And now this is important to discuss, to debate, to change. It is important to do a change, a transformation. And I think that is happening,
Obrigado. Olá, bom dia.
Good morning.
É o seguinte, eu vivi até aos 10 anos em Moçambique.
I lived in Mozambique until I was 10, and my father is a Mozambican citizen, and I was there in February, and the Portuguese tropical effects is marvelous to see. I'm not being ironical, but I also think it's excellent, the work that you're trying to do, and I think that in some years' time, we'll think about these people who are available to speak about this. So you are resilient, and I hope that you are regarded as special people in some years' time. All of your projects were developed in Portugal. Have you thought about developing them in Mozambique or Angola and with people in Mozambique and Angola? My sister, for example, lives there. And quite honestly, I think it would be interesting to understand how they saw on the other side, what were their views. Have you tried to do that? And perhaps it wasn't easy. Well, we work closely with people from Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, or even second-generation Portuguese whose fathers, parents had lived or were nationals of those countries. And these people are part of our work, of our discussions. Our work that we develop here was essentially oriented towards the Portuguese audience, because we believe that a lot of work had to still be done here, but it has been on show in Brazil, France, Spain, Germany, so it has gone to other countries. We haven't yet been in any African country. We very much want to go to Cape Verde, Mozambique, and Angola. We haven't yet been successful, but we are. This is something that we would very much like to do. More questions? Thank you very much. In your work, there is something very interesting, which is memory and post-memory. I would like to ask you, to what extent post-memory isn't a challenge in the development of the show. Post-memory is something is of someone who did not experience the situation like you, for example. Could you please repeat? It wasn't very clear. So you have memory and post-memory. They are both very different in the creation process and in the process of the creation of the object, in this case, the text, even if based on documents. So post-memory, like your memory, how does that help in setting up a creation, in the creation process? Well, I think it's of great help right from the start. The starting point is my need to understand who I am. Of course, these are memories that are conveyed. They are not very precise, but as Miriam Hirsch, who picks up on the concept of post-memory, says, memories are inherited and they become ours. So, these are memories that are built because we hear, we listen, and then we build an image, an experience that we did not experience. So this relationship between me, I, who am looking for myself, and it is important for me to understand my parents' parts and how important it is to say that I am a son of all of this, which is a very political position, because normally we say, no, I don't have anything to do with the past, with my parents or my grandparents' past. What happened was part of the history 200 years ago. A different thing is to say, I am the product of this, I am the son of this, and I think this is a very important starting point that helps foster discussion. Personally speaking, I was born after 1974, so I didn't go through fascism, the whole independence processes. I'm always very thirsty for understanding how all of this happened, and also the impacts on people's lives. And it's so very interesting to see how history modifies and interferes with the lives of people. And sometimes when we are going through the moments, we don't even realize all of this is happening. And only when we look back do we maintain a distance and we are able to understand better. So this looking back and looking now is what we must do. So look back, but also look at the impacts of that past on today, on the current days, on the present. And we have time for one more question.
Antes de mais,
well, first of all, thank you very much for this urgent and so much needed work that you've been developing. Well, I think that this is along the lines of processes and methodologies. When you work to collect testimonies from people, and you're speaking about interviews, the lady that was asking his husband whether he had killed anyone, and then when those people are confronted with your shows, when you in some way hand out, their contribution to them, how do people react? Thank you. Well, the reaction of people is not an homogeneous one. Some people don't want to watch the shows, they don't want to look into that part of their story, especially people that are more traumatized by what happened. They don't want to revisit that that period of their life. But they've all felt, or at least, the reaction that we get is, of being grateful, for the fact that somebody is showing, what they've been through, what they've lived. So all these stories were kept silent, they encompass a certain amount of pain, trauma, or the soldier that was in this war, and that saw somebody, one of his fellow soldiers die, so there is this whole aspect of actually putting all these stories in, or sharing all these stories with the public, with an audience, and it's not that people don't really want to tell the stories. Some people wanted to tell these stories, but society was not ready for them. And in that show that I called the Filhos do Colonialismo, the Sons of Colonialism, one of the things that I felt was very important was that in that group we had people that knew that their parents had shared with them almost everything they had gone through, and in other cases people knew that their parents had shared nothing of their previous life, and in some cases we had to share then that with the children, because it seemed that there was no room for that exchange in their private space. Obviously we also have cases of people that are not at ease with what we say or the way we look at things, and many people even understand for the same time that they need to look into their personal story and actually tell that story in a different manner. Some people we've interviewed spoke about their life in Angola and Mozambique as if it was a sort of a colonial paradise, but our spectacle really made them understand that they were part of the colonial regimen, but they were never really aware of that. I mean, before most of these people was actually being part of a tremendous system of oppression, but they were not aware of that. They could not visualize violence, and when they finally get to understand that this was wrong, there is a process of transformation. Before closing this session, I would like to ask you one last question. Do you consider that in some way this colonial past and the persistence of colonial structures in today's Portuguese society, does that have a reflex in the way theatre is produced here in Portugal? Well, I believe that even the ways of programming, of disseminating all this are being decolonized. I believe that they have been colonized for a long period of time, and that is what we are seeing now. I don't know whether a troupe like Aurora Negra could exist 20 years ago, and I believe that we can also think of many other situations. So I believe, yes, we're having a decolonization process in Portugal, and this transformation process is happening in several places, and yes, it's certainly in theatre. Thank you very much, André, and to all of you. Thank you.